Paul Bunyan. A tall tale retold and illustrated by Stephen Kellogg. And on them cats. Paul Bunyan was the largest, smartest, and strongest baby ever born in the state of Maine. Even before he learned to talk, Paul showed an interest in the family logging business. He took the lumber wagon and wandered through the neighborhood collecting trees. Watch out for that church. There were so many complaints about Paul's visits that his parents anchored his cradle into the harbor. All was well until Paul started rocking the cradle and stirring up the waves. After his parents paid for the damage, they decided to move backwoods where life would be more peaceful. Paul loved his new wilderness home. He soon grew into a sturdy lad who was so quick on his feet he could blow out a candle and leap into bed before the room had become dark. Every day he joined his forest friends in sports. He raced with the deer and wrestled with the grizzlies. One morning, Paul awoke to find the world under a blanket of blue snow. He heard a moan from outside the snowdrift, and there he found a shivering ox calf. Paul adopted him and named him Babe. Both Paul and Babe began growing at an astonishing rate. The ox never lost the color of the snow from which he'd been rescued. As the years passed, the two of them proved to be extremely helpful in the family business. At 17, Paul grew a fine beard, which he combed with the top of a pine tree. By the time the other settlers began to crowd into the Maine woods, Paul felt an urge to move on. He said goodbye to his parents and he headed west. Paul wanted to cross the country with the best lumbering crew available. He hired Ole, a celebrated blacksmith, and two famous cooks, Sourdough Slim and Cream Puff Fatty, and he signed up legendary lumbermen like Big Tim Burr, Hard Jaw Murphy, and the 7 Hackett brothers. There's them Hackett brothers now. You see them hacking at that tree. Paul put the camp buildings on wheels so that Babe could haul them from one forest to another. As soon as he cleared the land, the pioneers moved in to set up farms and villages. On the far slopes of the Appalachian Mountains, several of Paul's men were ambushed by a gang of the underground ogres called the Gumbaroos. Paul grabbed the camp dinner horn and blew a thunderous note into the Gumbaroos' cave, determined to blast the meanness right out of them. To Paul's dismay, the Gumbaroos responded by snatching his entire crew. The wild rough and tumble rumpus began inside the den. Poor Babe. When that historic tussle was over, the Gumbaroos needed 6 weeks to untangle themselves. They disappeared into the depths of the earth and have never been heard from since. Paul's next job was to clear the heavily forested Midwest. He hired armies of extra woodsmen and built an enormous new bunkhouse. The men settled into beds in balloons and parachuted down to breakfast in the mornings. Unfortunately, the cooks couldn't flip flapjacks fast enough to satisfy their new customers. To solve the muddle, Paul built a colossal flapjack griddle. The surface was greased by kitchen helpers with slabs of bacon laced to their feet. Every time the hot griddle was flooded with batter, it blasted the delicious flapjack high above the clouds. Usually the flapjacks landed beside the griddle, but sometimes they were a bit off target, landing on top of that skyscraper. Paul took a few days off to dig the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes so that barges of Vermont maple syrup could be brought to camp. That's a strong man there, Paul. Fueled by a powerful mixture of flapjacks and syrup, the men leveled the Great Plains and shaved the slopes of the Rocky Mountains. They probably would have sawed the peaks off themselves into logs if the blizzard hadn't suddenly buried the entire mountain range. The blizzard continued for several years, snuffing out the springs, the summers, and the autumns. The crew burrowed into their bunkhouses and hibernated. Babe became so depressed that Paul asked Ole to make a pair of sunglasses for his friend. When Babe saw the world colored green, he thought he'd stumbled onto a field of clover. He began eating the snow with such gusto that soon the treetops were reappearing. At that point, all those pent-up spring times simply exploded, dissolving the storm clouds and the remaining snow. Paul and his friends invited some newly arrived settlers to join them in the celebration of the holidays that they'd missed. After the Festival of Lumberjacks, they continued their journey. As they headed southwest, the blistering sun and the giant Texas varmints proved to be more of a problem than they suspected. Travel became so difficult that some of the men began to speak longingly about being buried by a blizzard or a bear or hugged by a gumbaroo. While crossing the Arizona, the griddle curled up like a burned leaf, and the batter evaporated. Deprived of flapjacks, the lumberman became weak and discouraged. Paul's great axe fell from his shoulder, gouging a jagged trench which is today known as the Grand Canyon. Disaster seemed certain until Paul came up with a desperate plan. He headed east and found a family that could sell him a barn filled with corn. Babe galloped it back across the desert, and when the flaming sunrise hit that barn, it exploded, and the lumbermen awoke to find themselves in a raging blizzard of popcorn. Dizzy with joy, they pulled on their mittens and began blasting each other with popcorn balls. Yee-hoo! A westerly wind kept the cooling clouds of popcorn swirling around Paul and his crew until they crossed California and raced the Pacific Ocean. Look at that big blue whale. After he crossed the country, some say that Paul gave up lumbering and rambled north searching for new areas of untouched wilderness. With the passing years, Paul has been seen less and less frequently. However, with his unusual size and strength, he seems to possess an extraordinary longevity. Sometimes his bursts of laughter can be heard rumbling across the desert like a wild Alaskan mountain range where he and Babe still roam.